It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachael Kohn. I could fill in the next hour telling you about her, as there is much to say. Rachael was appointed an Order of Australia and a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales for her eminent contribution to society in the field of promoting religious understanding across faiths and to Jewish studies, and for her distinguished service to the broadcast media, particularly radio, as a creator, producer, and presenter. She is the recipient of multiple awards for her work as producer and presenter of ABC radio and TV programs on religion, the best known program being The Spirit of Things. Rachael is also an author. Her most recent book, The Other Side of the Story, just hot off the press. For many years, I had enjoyed listening to Rachael on her radio programs. Her iconic voice was her identifying feature. So I had heard her and heard of her. But in 2019, I had the pleasure of meeting Rachael in person when she was the facilitator and speaker at the Spiritual Care Australia conference. Her ability to warmly introduce and succinctly articulate a keynote speaker's contribution was as impressive as her programs. A poem she read particularly resonated. She generously emailed me a copy of the poem in response to my request. That is a measure of her generosity and warmth of her spirit. The conference title was Setting the GPS, Finding Your Way in Spiritual Care. Little did we know in June 2019 what we would be facing some 9 months later. So perhaps today we are again setting the GPS as Rachael shares her views on making sense of our lives in the era of the pandemic, disbelief, amazement, fear, and faith. I lament the fact that we cannot all meet in person today, but rejoice that those attendees who are at considerable distance across Australia and in New Zealand can join us via this medium. We are honoured that you accepted our invitation to deliver the 3rd annual Roy Bradley Oration, Rachael. We warmly welcome you.
Thank you, Gillian and Eugen. It's really my honour to be speaking to you and to all of those present about a topic that is dear to our hearts. Let me begin. I was accosted by a friend at the beach. She's outgoing, attractive, well-read, and older, with mature children and grandchildren. She's always the first to exclaim, "Isn't this wonderful?" as she regards the watery expanse of our local beach in Sydney Harbour, where we swim each morning. But that day, although it was warm and sunny, she was tearful as she declared that she'd had enough. She's sick of everything, sick of doing mundane tasks, sick of shopping, sick of cleaning, sick of the monotony, and sick of the worry that we are all going nowhere. She was sick of the pandemic, but fortunately not sick with it. An important difference. In fact, my friend was the first to notify my husband and I about a facility where we could get our shots right away, which we did back in April. So I was alarmed by this practical and thoughtful woman's overwhelming despair. It was bordering on panic. Most of us over the past 2 years have grimly watched as the world, our country, our state, our city, our neighborhood, and our personal lives steadily shrunk down to a few regular, it can be said, monotonous activities. After almost 2 years, you'd think we were all accustomed to this pared down existence where travel has stopped, leisure has simplified, shopping has truncated to the bare necessities, and socializing has been confined for the most part to our immediate neighborhoods. Suddenly, the popular African proverb, "It takes a village," rings hollow. It refers to the way children are best cared for and raised in a close-knit community. But without warning, it became all too real. This shrunken circle of life has raised many profound questions that run to the heart of our existence, such as what is the meaning of our lives? What has it all been for? And when all is said and done, who are we? Without having a solid answer to these questions, it can seem like life was feeling pointless, which was exactly what my friend was saying. She felt like she was disappearing. For many people, and especially in our current zeitgeist, who we are has become increasingly defined by our identity. Yet the changed economic and social environment of lockdown has whittled away some of the structure and outward signs of modern day versions of identity. Who we thought we were can include being a denizen of a chic suburb, a frequenter of a popular bar or cafe, a flaneur of a favorite shopping area, a social butterfly with lots of friends, or a lover of the arts who regularly visits the art gallery, sees a play at the theater, and attends musical performances at the concert hall, a traveler to interesting destinations, an employee of a well-known company. You might also be a person who dressed in carefully chosen vintage clothes, favored brand names and designers, got your hair done regularly in the latest cut or color, and artfully displayed your jewelry at public events. In short, when you stop to think about it, the outward signs of identity of many people today are hanging in their closet and sitting in their cupboards. Yet it is what shapes their world, their relationships, how they see their own worth. They're encouraged to assiduously cultivate these outward markers of identity, even to the point of having the latest model mobile phone, the right brand of computer or car, and even reading the books everyone else is, or ditto websites. When itemized, these things can all seem pretty frivolous. Nonetheless, it can feel catastrophic when all the things that inform who you think you are gradually are removed or suddenly disappear. In today's popular culture, which is assertively secular, the desire for special, individually curated identities has not diminished, but grown. Without the received identity of one's religious community or even one's sex, a person's sense of belonging is not a given, but is the choice and responsibility of every individual to create and display. And these choices are expected of you as much as they are unfailingly judged. Yet they're also dictated by fashion, fads, and shifting ideologies, all of it accelerated by the social media on which we feed. What are these identity markers for, but to fit into the latest iteration of what's acceptable, desirable, and valued? The irony of late 20th century liberalism is that the vaunted ideal of the individual places the burden of identity onto each and every one to create and recreate for him or herself well into the future. In fact, anything that is informed by tradition and preserving and conserving what has been valued for centuries is considered passé at best, offensive at worst. As one philosopher put it, we are orphans of history at the same time as we are consumers of the new. It can all seem like a free run, an adventure, and a journey with no particular destination. It can be exciting as long as it keeps going. The idea that one's identity is simply a DIY kit, a do-it-yourself kit, is promoted by a large number of people in the realm of New Age thinking. Their message is that you are the locus and creator of yourself, so get out of your own way. You're not constrained by anything other than fear itself. Once you take the leap, you can be anything you want to be many times over. One of the popular proponents of this kind of protean identity is Neil Donald Walsch, who wrote, or should I say dictated, a series of bestseller books called Conversations with God, 1, 2, and 3. His message, which he purports is a verbatim account of God's conversations with him, is that there are no right and wrong expectations. There are no activities that are inherently good or bad. There's nothing that is required of you. And there's no necessary moral dimension of life that should make you feel bad or fearful of not measuring up. In short, Walsh's books are a kind of satire of religion itself, because in throwing out its moral foundation, he promotes disbelief in anything you've ever thought was true. To sum up, disbelief is the first step to being whoever you want to be. Crucial to Walsh's message is that whatever you want to be is okay with God, because as Walsh confidently reports, God told him he does not disapprove of anyone, including Hitler. Yes, you heard right. Hitler or Homer Simpson are all the same to Walsh's God, since moral distinctions are not true because they're based on fear. Walsh's message that the God of morality is not true is certainly not original. It's a late footnote in a century of thinking that criticized religion as moral guardian and painted God as the ultimate source of fear. Proponents of that view are legion among the new atheists, but it was best epitomized by Bertrand Russell in his talk, Why I Am Not a Christian, given in the Battersea Town Hall in 1927. The British philosopher categorically and famously stated that religion is based on fear, and that scientific knowledge would free one from both religion and fear. Many believed him, and like Russell, they looked to political systems that would epitomize their ideals. For Russell, utopia was to be found in Soviet Russia, but his meeting with Lenin proved a disappointment because he found him autocratic and cruel. So Russell looked to China and traveled there. Others who believed in the anti-religion movement could not ignore the fact that religion continued in the decades that followed. What to do but interrogate all religions and come up with a new answer? The New Age was the record of that investigation, and its message, by and large, was to champion a lifelong search for spiritual knowledge everywhere and anywhere, so long as it leads to individual empowerment. The human potential movement was born. The proverbial fear of God turned into a fearless search to be whatever you want to be. A host of New Age gurus of the human potential movement trumpeted the end of fear. Perhaps the best known among them was Jean Houston. Remember her? She visited Australia several times, filling auditoriums and promoting her notion of jump time as a way of being whoever you want to be. As she put it, everybody is looking for a door, a portal to that larger life that you can just jump into. For her, it was jumping into any one of the myths, the stories, the past lives, which were available to her through Jungian connections, and her friend Joseph Campbell, author of Hero with a Thousand Faces. Famously, she mentored Hillary Clinton for a time, who discovered that she was Athena in a past life. In this kind of mythic universe, you can elect to live a dream and reinvent yourself. Hillary hoped to be the next president of the United States. Both Houston and Walsh and a host of other touring speakers gave their audience a carte blanche, a get out of jail free card to be whoever you want to be. But here's the kicker. When your life gets really challenging because many things are actually out of your control, it can be catastrophic to realize that who you thought you were was largely ephemeral, possibly just a figment of your imagination. Now, I fully admit here that I'm not a believer in or an advocate of past lives regression, and this might put me on the other side of where some people are at, but I say this in the interest of full disclosure. So what happens when those sources of identity disappear and seem like a denial of who you are? It ought to raise some doubts about the value and worth of those outward markers of identity, which we cling to and post regularly on Facebook and Instagram. I agree with the French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, who was commenting on the impoverishment of identity politics. I think what he has to say has some relevance to the limitation of identity as the essence of who you are. He says, a real being is always richer, more sophisticated, more complicated than any identity. So this will to reduce the singularity of an individual to an identity is a pity. What is interesting in your life is not your identity, but the escape out of your identity. You're a free woman or man if you rebel against your identity, not if you are cocooned in your identity. Bernard-Henri Lévy. For people who are feeling that their lives are pointless because the pandemic has closed down many of the outward signs of their identity and the opportunities to display it, one could conclude that their real problem is that they've latched on to ephemera instead of something fundamental about life and being a person of worth. The desire to fit in, which is a strong motivation for today's identity obsession, is something perhaps we should question and maybe resist with discretion. I'm suggesting that your identity is not who you are. In fact, you could be spending far too much time, money, and emotional investment into perfecting it. Bernard-Henri Lévy says one should escape out of the cocoon of identity, but escape to what? Here's what I said to my friend on the beach. When she looked like she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, I said, I have something to give you. I'll bring it tomorrow. It's a book by a woman who I know you will admire. She has something to teach us. Sometimes we need to gain perspective on where we are at the moment, and this book has done it for me profoundly. War in Val d'Orcia, 1943 to 44, is a war diary by an Anglo-American woman who adopted Italy as her home country when she was a girl, and her widowed mother moved to Florence. Later, when she was about 19, Iris married an Italian, and from their home in Tuscany, Iris Origo documented the impact of the Second World War on Italy. Now you might think, Tuscany, isn't that where romance blooms and red geraniums decorate the windowsills of picturesque villas in a beautiful hilly countryside lined with cypress trees? But it was nothing like that then. It was a time when Italy was dirt poor, became a fascist state under Mussolini, then joined with Germany under Hitler, harbored a major partisan movement against Mussolini's black shirts who were storming the villages and streets of the cities, then experienced the long, slow liberation by the Allies as they moved north, followed by the Germans' retaliatory scorched earth policy. At war with itself, Italy was completely confusing to the people as cities were bombed, hundreds of bridges blown up, peasants were massacred, Jews and resistors were deported to concentration camps, Starving children and mothers, refugees and escaped prisoners crisscrossed the land. People died in roadside ditches, were summarily shot by men in uniform, and diseases like diphtheria, typhus, and TB claimed thousands, including Iris's firstborn, her 7-year-old son. Yet, Iris Arrigo was a determined, purposeful, focused young woman, bringing hope and, most of all, practical help to everyone who came her way. Despite enormous danger to herself and her family, she welcomed the hundreds who did seek her help. Married to Antonio Arrigo, together in the late 1920s, they had transformed the poor, windswept, and desolate land of southwest Tuscany under Mount Amiata into a viable farming region with a school, a clinic, and decent housing. They worked wonders. Both Iris and Antonio were from privileged stock, yet they were also both outsiders for different reasons. Humble and humane, they loved the land and the people. But her resolve and activity during Italy's most catastrophic period was in high contrast to the Anglo-Florentines with whom Iris was intimate. They were a famous bunch who had made the beautiful Renaissance city of Florence their home, and whose social lives revolved around their villas, their soirees and salons, their poetry readings and recently published works, their political and philosophical discussions, their garden parties, and their multitude of affairs, it must be said. Names like the art critic and collector Bernard Berenson, the writers Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Lytton Strachey, and a host of other names of the Bloomsbury set that littered 20th century English literature constituted the Anglo-Florentines. They were the equivalent of the literati today who frequent writers' festivals. But when the barbaric and brutal history of war bore down on them, they were bereft. Their carefully crafted essays and social lives, reputations and identities were no match for the courage that was required, and they fled. Many never recovered. Iris stayed and wrote in one of her unpublished diaries that amongst the Anglo-Florentine circle of great minds, many discussed what specific kinds of government enable the good life, as if in some Platonic world. And this is where the point of the story is quite relevant to us now, where a continuous round of complaints about the government have become a national pastime. Iris reflected shortly after the war, saying, "With every passing year, I disagree profoundly with that view that the right government can guarantee the good life." Although she readily admitted that totalitarianism is a form of government exemplified by both fascism and communism, make the full blooming of the human spirit more difficult, she also cautioned, "But I believe that in all countries, under all governments, the good life is possible. It is like heaven, not a place, but a state. It's not a place, but a state of being," one could say. In a sense, it was predictable that her largely secular Anglo-Florentine friends believed that the perfect solution for their hardships would be delivered by some ideal government structure. Their carefully curated identities were useless in times of war. They were like delicate plants grown in a glass atrium, completely vulnerable once the bubble was shattered. Iris was not religious in an ideal way. Yet from the outside, you wouldn't pick it. Her forebears were Anglican and Quaker. However, she was married to a Catholic, lived in a Catholic country, and attended Catholic Mass. She celebrated the festivals with enthusiasm and care with the refugee children she harbored and protected, along with her own. In all this, I think Iris demonstrated how arrogant is the notion that religion as mere ritual is somehow inferior to profound faith. Later in life, Iris tried to believe in God in the same way as did her close friend Elsa, with whom she worked for the Red Cross in Rome, and who was her great mentor. Elsa, a widow, encouraged Iris to nurture an intimate, personal relationship to God, which could feed her soul in a personal way. But in the end, Iris was more drawn to moral action than the consolations of belief, because as she so profoundly demonstrated, the good life is what you do despite all the difficulties that stand in your way. Her unspoken philosophy reminded me of the book, God is the Good You Do, written by the expat Australian architect and philosopher, Michael Benedict. Michael's book is an outline of theopraxy, a God who's realized in doing good deeds for the good of others and the world at large. I'm reminded of the American Franciscan priest, Richard Rohr, who told me that his Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was named thus because action is more important than sitting on your behind and contemplating what you might do. For many years, Iris Arrigo wanted to write a book on compassion. She made many notes and false starts on it. I believe as a talented author who researched and wrote several biographies, she never did write that book because she suspected deep down that if she reduced it to some formula by putting her thoughts on paper, she might end up treating compassion with the reserve and rationality which she brought to all her writing. She might thereby rob the compassion which she so consciously demonstrated in her life of the mysterious and passionate source from which it sprung. I believe the mystery at the core of her life, which was informed by the religious values of her father and grandfather and the church, was not reducible to those values alone. The mystery at the core of her life was experienced by Iris as an interactive, two-way relationship, which included the joy she brought to others, the relief, the healing, the gratitude, the love that she witnessed when she brought comfort to people who were in strife. This was her good life, and it not only served those she helped, and in many cases saved from death, but it secretly served and saved her soul. I think this closely reflects Roy Bradley's concept of redemptive relationships. Iris Arrigo was deeply committed to humility, which stood her apart from the Anglo-Florentines with whom she was a natural ally, but with whom she was often uncomfortable. Intellectually, they provided her with the kind of stimulation she needed as a well-read woman who spoke 4 languages, English, Italian, French, and German. But she recoiled from the narcissism, the self-importance, the arrogance, and also the indolence which marked their lives. On the one hand, she recognized that they were important writers and personalities with a lot to say. But she also regarded them as flawed human beings who were often aloof to the concerns of ordinary Italians, whom they could both dismiss as mere peasants and also romanticize through the rose-colored lenses of their privileged literary lives. Humility was very important to Iris and also to her husband, Antonio, who shared that characteristic. It was the bond between these two very different people. I want to say a word here about humility, which may be a natural endowment to some people and not to others. Can we learn it? Sometimes people who've undergone tremendous suffering and yet survive are the natural bearers of humility because they truly know how quickly and brutally life can end, and yet how precious it is. Iris lost her beloved first child and knew how quickly life could be snuffed out and how precious it was. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish philosopher who was a leading light in the civil rights movement in America and a close friend of Martin Luther King Jr., wrote about humility as a state of radical amazement, which he felt was the sine qua non, the necessary quality of the religious person. Heschel said, as civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Such decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness, Heschel said, lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. I would bet that Heschel in the 1960s was reading the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was so popular then, and who said, isn't our need for knowledge precisely this need for the familiar? The will to uncover under everything strange, unusual, and questionable, something that no longer disturbs us. Isn't it the instinct of fear that bids us to know? And is the jubilation of those who attain knowledge not the jubilation over the restoration of a sense of security? He wrote that in The Gay Science, by the way, in 1882. There's a sadness in Nietzsche's realization that our need to reduce everything unfamiliar to something familiar means we no longer marvel at it. Heschel also sees our constant need for knowledge as an addiction that numbs our ability to experience radical amazement at something greater than ourselves, not fully knowable, and yes, a touch unfathomable. Two things in our world now indicate how removed we are from that appreciation of which Heschel spoke. First is the secular quasi-scientific belief that it is only information we need to set the world right, our children's education right, our businesses right, our relationships right, our government policies right. And we're sure that the right stuff is out there on Google or Twitter. The desire for information dominates our lives, as well as the ostentatious parading of it. We've been told, after all, that it's possible to entirely control our lives, guarantee longevity, meditate away our troubles, eat the right foods, live the longest possible life, read the most reliable journals. When Heschel talked about radical amazement, he was not just referring to being amazed at a volcanic eruption, a beautiful sunset, or the perfectly arranged petals of a flower. Dare I say, not even the beautiful beach where I swim each day calls for radical amazement. And as for that awesome cup of coffee, that doesn't cut it either. Heschel was talking about all of reality, not only what we see or taste or feel. That itself can become an addiction to the next amazing thing. Heschel is referring to something that underlies it all and comes down to a fundamental mystery of life and of being, what Paul Tillich called the ground of being. Tillich did not invent the concept. It is actually there in the biblical tradition that informed him, expressed in 1,000 ways, which point to the immensity of creation, God's countless wonders of which we are one. It reinforces the humility that properly belongs to us. But what is that humility for? Is it just to live as if we are insignificant, no more or no less than a caterpillar on a leaf? To treat an ant with the same reverence as a grandparent? I don't think so. I believe humility is the attitude we need to fulfill our tasks as carers of each other and of everything around us, our homes, our gardens, our family, our neighborhoods, our society, our country, and our planet. In a recent volume I edited on fear and faith, Christian, Jewish, and evolutionary perspectives, I summoned an international array of scholars from Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, America, and Israel to examine how fear and faith not only makes us human, but also how they are embedded in our biblical tradition. But here's the important bit. In English, fear can be many different things. Fear can be terror of something seen, trepidation at something unseen, and helplessness before horror. Or it can be the term used in the Hebrew Bible, yirah, which was translated as fear in the King James Version, but which means awe, the sense of smallness before greatness. And as expressed in the Hebrew Bible, a mixture of love, honor, and respect toward one's creator and all of creation, at which one marvels. It is exactly what the prophet Micah says in chapter 6, 7-8, when he asks rhetorically if God will be pleased with sacrifices at the temple, a synonym for having the right stuff. No, insists the Jewish prophet Micah. He hath shown thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? This is the teaching which in the Hebrew Bible and also in the New Testament is repeatedly put before the people, and it remains a valued character trait which is represented in popular literature as well. For example, in the figure of Bob Cratchit in Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol, and in the figure of Tevye in Sholem Aleichem's Fiddler on the Roof. It is about humility that is quite saintly, an ideal to which the tradition strives and gives meaning to humble, poor, and benighted lives. Tevye is a figure in Eastern Europe who represents the village Jews who were persecuted out of existence. And Cratchit is the proverbial impoverished, struggling soul in the newly industrialized Britain. Both figures are keenly humble, yet they steadfastly believe in the values of their faith, which guide their actions and gives them joy, compassion, and wisdom, and most of all, courage to endure what inevitably is visited on them in circumstances they cannot control, but must respond to. Life is a narrow bridge. We must learn not to be daunted by our fear. We have been browbeaten by the positivity brigade into believing that fear is bad and therefore we must banish fear. But that is not the message I would like to convey. First of all, fear of the unknown will always be with us because we cannot know everything, nor what it has in store for us. Second, fear is one of the most essential requirements of survival, both at the individual and at the group level. As Charles Darwin noted, and as those who study religion and evolution, like Dom Johnson, have also demonstrated. But fear can also be debilitating. Be not afraid is a constant refrain in the Bible. And later Jewish commentaries also recognized that fear, which hardens the heart into meekness and inaction, leads to misfortune. Even in the 12th century, the Jewish philosopher and physician Moses Maimonides wrote about the dire consequences of dread and fear in his book On the Regimen of Health. 7 centuries later, the great Lutheran theologian, activist, and martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a sermon on overcoming fear, in which he characterized fear as the devil because it showed a lack of faith, which in the end could destroy a person's will and desire to live. He likened the condition to the frightened disciples in the tempest-tossed boat in the Sea of Galilee, which prompted Jesus to admonish them, saying, "Ye of little faith." Yet how do we live with an abiding fear? Our world at present is full of threats, real and imagined. We've had the 2 years of a worldwide pandemic that has killed more than 7.7 million people, shut down economies, livelihoods, and family relationships. China's retaliation and prominent displays of its war machine may soon put the world on a war footing. Closer to home, we have a restive population in a country that seems divided against itself, threatening the very sense of our nationhood. And we've had shocking neo-Nazi incidents in Australia, exacerbating social and cultural conflicts, which are making many people on the other side of 60 and 70 feel more alien to the Australia they call home. Television, social media, and the World Wide Web has accelerated panic, hostility, conflict, polarity, and violence. It is harder and harder to feel hope in the future, and yet it is essential to have hope. The Jewish sage Nachman of Bratslav has been a source of many inspirational sayings, and the quote that I'm about to share with you has even become a popular song. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od v'ha'ikar lo lifa chet klal. The whole world is a bridge, and the essential thing is to pass over and not to succumb to fear. Rabbi Jennifer Frankel says, the saying does not deny fear, nor does it say you must not be afraid, only that you must not succumb to it. It's about the courage to continue with hope. It is in our responses to adversity that we are most tested, as right now we are being tested by COVID-19 and many other circumstances that Australians have suffered and will continue to suffer in their personal lives as part of the human condition. My friend on the beach returned the favor to me. She lent me a book, The Hiding Place, that gave her much encouragement in her Christian faith, drawing again on a story of a woman in the Second World War. Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch middle-aged spinster, and her sister and old father, who were watchmakers in Haarlem, hid Jews and members of the underground in their home during the Nazi takeover of the Netherlands. They were Protestants, and they were betrayed and were arrested and taken to prison where their father died. Corrie and her sister Betsy were taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany, where Betsy died. Yet despite her weak condition, Betsy was extraordinarily above her own suffering, having smuggled a small Bible into the camp, which she read daily and shared with others. It was Betsy's faith which gave Corey and others a perspective on how to view their suffering and who they were. These two middle-aged spinsters recognized that the dignity freely given to humankind transcended the depredations of misguided Nazi guards. It was that saying again of Nachman of Bratslav, the world is a narrow bridge. The task is not to succumb to fear, but to walk over it with the dignity of knowing who you really are. Eddie Jaku died in mid-October. He was 101. I had the privilege of knowing him. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust, beginning on the night of Kristallnacht, November 9th to 10th, 1938, when the Nazis burst into his home in Leipzig and tortured his dog before bashing Eddie almost to death. He endured several concentration camps, but survived. Eddie spent his later years speaking to high school students at the Sydney Jewish Museum, and also by giving a TED talk about his story, but more importantly, his message, not to hate, but to love. He told them why he was the happiest man on earth, which is the title of his memoir, published when he was 99 years old. 2 weeks before he died, wearing a bright sweater, he looked in the picture of health. He recorded an interview, and his words reminded me of Iris Arrigo when he said he was alive because of friends, because of friendship, which has always given him hope. He said, in the current world where people are closing up, be friendly, be kind. If you can love, love with all your heart. He said, there are no miracles, but people whose acts of loving kindness make miracles happen, the greatest of them being to give someone their life back, to save someone's life. To me, the meaning of our life is that fundamentally, we are given it as a sacred trust. Creation spirituality binds us. It's a term Matthew Fox promoted, but it is enshrined in our biblical tradition, by which we are encouraged to be radically amazed and thankful to be alive. I would like to thank you for sharing this moment with me. And I would also like to beg your indulgence for 2 more minutes. There are 2 poems that encapsulate my message, I think, and they were chosen by 2 people who work at the opposite ends of life. An obstetric social worker who chose a poem by Mary Oliver, and the other a canon in England who journeys with people who are dying. The poem by Mary Oliver is called Mysteries, Yes. Truly, we live with mysteries too marvelous to be understood. How grass can be nourishing in the mouths of lambs. How rivers and stones are forever in allegiance with gravity, while we ourselves dream of rising. How 2 hands touch and the bonds will never be broken. How people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Let me keep my distance, always, from those who think they have the answers. Let me keep company always with those who say, look, and laugh in astonishment and bow their heads. That was chosen by the obstetric social worker, and this by Reverend Canon Rosie Harper in England. It's by Raymond Carver, late fragment. And did you get what you wanted from life, even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. That by Raymond Carver. Thank you so much for listening to me today.